March 28, 1945. The end was supposed to be near. The German army was in total collapse. Supply lines were severed and entire divisions were surrendering. American tanks drove deep into the heart of Bavaria, meeting little resistance. But when the soldiers of the United States 45th Infantry Division approached the city of Aschaffenburg, the rhythm of the war changed. The city did not surrender. It didn't even go quiet. Instead, the Americans met a wall of fire. Why did this small city resist? The Reich was already dead. But Major Emil Lamberth had issued a different order. He demanded a fight to the last man. At first glance, a routine cleanup operation, but in reality, a bloodbath. The footage from the front lines shows the reality. Smoke rises over the medieval rooftops. Soldiers crouch behind stone walls. The sound of sniper fire echoes through the narrow streets. This wasn't a tactical defense. It was a desperate, fanatical stand. Civilians were forced into the trenches. Young boys carried Panzerfausts. Officers executed anyone who suggested a white flag. The streets were filled with the smell of cordite and burning wood. The 45th Division expected a quick victory. They found a fortress instead. Events accelerated. The American commander called in the heavy artillery. The city was systematically leveled, block by block. 12 days of brutal urban combat followed. Every cellar became a bunker. Every window held a rifleman. There was no turning back. The battle for Aschaffenburg became a grim preview of the war's final weeks. It proved that a cornered enemy is the most dangerous. The city fell only after it was reduced to rubble. April 1945. American soldiers entered the outskirts of the German city. They looked up at the row of iron lampposts lining the main street. Dozens of bodies hung from the crossbars. These were not enemy combatants. They were civilians. The soldiers saw old men with gray hair, middle-aged women, and teenagers barely 16 years old. Heavy wooden signs hung around their necks. The text was clear. Here hangs a traitor because he believed in the Americans. These victims had not picked up rifles. They had not fought the Allied advance. They had simply tried to survive. When the tanks approached, these families hung white sheets from their windows to signal surrender. For that act, their own German commander ordered their execution. The American troops stood in the street and stared at the swaying bodies. The camera would show faces hardened by 3 years of war. They were not sad, they were furious. They looked at the city ahead. Aschaffenburg was a medieval fortress town. It was filled with historic architecture and stone cathedrals. The soldiers made a cold decision. How did the Americans respond to this atrocity? At first glance, they prepared for an assault, but in reality, they chose total destruction. The officers refused to send their men into house-to-house fighting. They would not risk American lives for a city that murdered its own children. The commander picked up his radio handset. The sound of static filled the air. He did not call for infantry support. He called for the heavy artillery batteries. He did not request a precision strike on military targets. He ordered a barrage on every square meter of the city. His instructions were simple. Level it. Turn every stone building into fine gray dust. If the inhabitants wanted to die for Hitler, the U.S. Army would provide the means. Events accelerated. This is the true account of the total erasure of Aschaffenburg. It was the day the U.S. Army stopped playing by the rules of conventional warfare. It was the day they encountered a fanatical Nazi major named Lamberth who refused to quit. The result was a brutal explosive punishment delivered to a civilian population. But why did this commander choose a massacre over a surrender? To understand why a city was wiped off the map, we have to meet the villain, Emil Lamberth. He was not a typical soldier. Lamberth was a fanatic and a radical believer in National Socialism. By March 1945, the German High Command realized the end was near. Most officers sought a way to surrender with their dignity intact. Lamberth chose a different path. He held command over Aschaffenburg, a strategic point on the main river. He carried a direct order from Adolf Hitler. The command was simple: Festung Aschaffenburg, Fortress Aschaffenburg, defend it to the last stone. Lamberth took these words literally. He ignored the safety of the civilians. He disregarded the centuries of history within the city walls. He valued only absolute obedience. He gathered his remaining forces. Very few regular battle-hardened soldiers remained in his ranks. To fill the gaps, he mobilized the Volkssturm. These were the people's storm units. He lined up old men holding personal hunting rifles. He stood them next to boys from the Hitler Youth who were barely 15 years old. He even dragged wounded soldiers from their hospital beds to the front lines. Why did they follow him? It wasn't loyalty. It was pure terror. Lamberth issued a lethal ultimatum. Anyone attempting to surrender would be shot on sight. Anyone hanging a white flag from a window would be hanged. He stated the terms clearly. They would fight until the Americans were dead or they were dead. The residents of Aschaffenburg watched the horizon. They saw the silhouettes of American tanks moving closer. They wanted to protect their families and save their children from the coming fire. Behind closed doors, in the dark, they stitched together white bedsheets to make flags. But Lamberth had a network of spies in every neighborhood. The footage would show a city in panic. On the morning of the American arrival, Lamberth's execution squads moved through the streets. They kicked in doors and dragged civilians onto the pavement. They did not use bullets, they used rope. The sound of boots on cobblestones echoed through the alleys. The squads worked quickly. They left bodies swinging from balconies and lampposts as a warning to the rest. When the American tanks finally reached the outskirts, they did not see a city ready to surrender. They saw a city held hostage by its own commander. There was no way out. The battle was about to begin. Thus, the tragedy of Aschaffenburg was set in motion. March 28, 1945. The 45th Infantry Division, known as the Thunderbirds, reached the outskirts. They moved with total confidence. Based on recent battles, the officers expected a quick surrender. They assumed the town would fall by sunset. The first unit entered the suburbs. 24 infantrymen walked down the center of the street. Silence. The shops were boarded up with heavy timber. Every window was shut tight. The only sound was the crunch of combat boots on gravel. Suddenly, a single rifle shot cracked through the air. A machine gun opened fire from a second-story balcony. Then, the distinct roar of a Panzerfaust rocket launcher. The lead jeep exploded into a ball of fire. The Americans scrambled for cover behind stone walls. They were caught in a crossfire from every direction. Snipers fired from the church steeple. Muzzles flashed from dark basement windows. Even the sewer grates provided cover for the shooters. But the enemy was not who they expected. The footage from the front lines shows the truth. The Americans were not just fighting soldiers in gray uniforms. In the frame, an old man in a business suit aiming a bolt-action rifle. In the frame, women leaning over rooftops to drop grenades into open hatches. In the frame, children barely 10 years old pulling triggers. Major Lamberth had radicalized the entire population. He used loudspeakers to spread a single message: surrender means certain death. He claimed the Americans would butcher every man, woman, and child. He didn't just defend the city, he turned every citizen into a combatant. How did the Thunderbirds respond? At first, with total hesitation, the American soldiers froze. They had orders to engage the enemy, but the enemy looked like their own families back home. They didn't want to kill children. They didn't want to shoot grandfathers. But this hesitation became a death sentence. Men fell in the streets. Medics struggled to pull the wounded into alleyways under heavy fire. Casualties mounted within minutes. Ambulance jeeps raced back and forth, tires screeching as they hauled the bleeding away from the front. The easy victory had vanished. Aschaffenburg had become a meat grinder. The American commanders met in a command post 3 miles outside the city. They looked at the maps and heard the reports of the mounting body count. There was no turning back. 31 dead. That was the count of American soldiers killed by civilians who refused to surrender. Then, the scouts returned with new reports. The images were grim. German citizens were hanging from lampposts in the town square. Major Emil Lamberth had ordered their execution because they tried to stop the senseless fighting. The atmosphere in the American camp changed instantly. This was no longer a mission of liberation. It was a mission of punishment. The American commander studied the map of Aschaffenburg. his eyes fixed on one point: Schloss Johannesburg. It was a massive stone fortress with 4 towers looming over the entire city. Lambert was inside those walls. The commander put down his pencil. He made a choice. He would not send more young men to die in narrow alleys or stone corridors. There would be no more street fighting. There would be no more chivalry. He decided to use brute force. The order went out for the heavy equipment. He called in the 155mm long tom artillery. He summoned the M12 gun motor carriages. These were massive self-propelled cannons built specifically to crush concrete and stone. Then he contacted the Air Force. A new command reached the front lines. The troops received the signal to retreat. The soldiers pulled back from the city center. They moved out of the kill zones and abandoned the streets they had just fought for. The message from headquarters was clear. The Americans were not going to capture the city. They were going to destroy it. Why waste lives on a fortress? The answer was simple. Steel is cheaper than blood. The sun went down over the ruins. At first glance, a quiet evening. But in reality, the final hours of the city. The bombardment began the next morning at dawn. The ground shook. The sound of heavy shells filled the air. The camera records the result, smoke rising from the castle towers. The massive stones began to crumble under the weight of the explosives. There was no mistake. The era of the fortress was over. The shelling did not stop for hours. This was the end of Aschaffenburg. This was not a strike. It was an erasure. The American forces positioned their heavy artillery on the hills overlooking the urban center. They did not aim for the horizon. They leveled the barrels of their guns until the steel tubes pointed directly at the streets below. Usually, artillery fires in a high arc over long distances. Here, the crews fired point blank. The shells hit the buildings at high velocity. It was systematic destruction, block by block, house by house. The 155mm shells smashed into the medieval timber-framed structures. These historic walls offered no resistance. The buildings did not simply break. They disintegrated into dust and splinters. Fire broke out across the district. The city began to burn. In the sky, P-47 Thunderbolt fighters dived from the clouds. They released their payloads. Inside the city, the situation turned into a massacre. Major Lamberth remained in his bunker beneath the castle. He monitored the radio and issued commands. He ordered his men to hold their positions until the end. "The Americans are weak," he shouted to his officers. He claimed the enemy was afraid to enter the city, but the Americans were not afraid. They were efficient. The commanders realized there was no tactical reason to sacrifice soldiers for a city that refused to surrender. They chose shells over lives. An American sergeant recorded the scene in his diary. He wrote that they sat on the hill and watched the fires spread. Why didn't the infantry advance? At first glance, it looked like cowardice, but in reality, it was a cold calculation. The sergeant noted that after seeing the bodies hanging from the lampposts, he felt no sympathy. He believed the city brought this destruction upon itself. The footage shows black smoke rising in thick columns, the camera records, the collapsing shells of century-old homes. The sound of heavy explosions is constant. This became one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war. The military destroyed an entire city to save American lives. Was it a justified tactic, or was it excessive force? These are the hard questions of history. Events accelerated. After 3 days of continuous shelling, the city was a graveyard. The resistance vanished. Thus ended the battle, April 3, 1945. The Siege of Aschaffenburg reached its breaking point. Schloss Johannesburg still dominated the skyline. It was a massive fortress of red sandstone. The construction dated back to 1614. Its walls measured 8 feet thick. Inside, Major Lamberth waited with his most fanatical troops. These were men who refused to accept defeat. The Americans arrived to finish the job. They did not send infantry squads to storm the gates. That would be suicide. Instead, they brought forward the heavy armor. An M12 gun motor carriage clattered into position. This was a 155mm cannon mounted on tank tracks. The crew parked the vehicle directly in front of the castle. It was point-blank range. The camera would show the German soldiers staring through narrow arrow slits. They watched the massive barrel level out. It pointed straight at their positions. The first shell impacted the main tower. Stone disintegrated. A cloud of red dust filled the air. The Americans fired again, then again. Each round punched through walls that had stood for 300 years. The castle began to burn. The wooden roof supports gave way and collapsed into the courtyard. Inside the ruins, the situation was chaotic. The sound of screaming filled the corridors. Many of the defenders were teenagers. They were terrified. They were crying. They begged Major Lamberth to surrender. They shouted that they could not fight a wall of fire. Lamberth did not listen. He pulled his Luger. He threatened to shoot any man who stopped fighting. He screamed about the oath to the Führer. But even fanatical discipline has a limit. The men had enough. The morning of April 3rd arrived. The shooting from the castle suddenly stopped. A white flag appeared through a jagged hole in the masonry. The Americans ceased fire. Slowly, the German soldiers emerged from the ruins. They were covered in fine red sandstone dust. They coughed and stumbled over the rubble. In the sunlight, they looked like ghosts rising from a grave. Then, Major Lamberth stepped out. His uniform was clean. His medals were pinned to his chest. He kept his chin up. He remained arrogant even as his command lay in ruins. The battle for the fortress was over. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the same commander who would later lead the liberation of Dachau. Major Lamberth stood before him and offered a formal salute. Lamberth began to speak about honor. He talked about duty to the fatherland. Sparks did not listen. He turned away. The footage shows the scene. Sparks looks at the ruins of Aschaffenburg. Black smoke rises from the skeletons of buildings. Dead civilians lie on the pavement. They died because Lamberth refused to surrender. Sparks did not return the salute. He looked at his military police. He told them to take Lamberth away before he shot him himself. What happened next? The soldiers acted immediately. They stripped Lamberth of his sidearms. They took his medals. They threw him into the back of a jeep like a common prisoner. At first glance, a proud officer, but in reality, a man who ruined his own people. As the jeep moved, the citizens of Aschaffenburg crawled out of their cellars. They were covered in dust and ash. They did not cheer for their commander. They spat on him. They screamed at the vehicle. They called him a murderer. They watched their homes burn and blamed him for the fire. The battle lasted 10 days. It should have lasted 10 hours. One man's fanaticism caused the destruction of 90% of the city. Hundreds of civilians were dead in the rubble. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed or wounded in the streets. General George Patton arrived shortly after. He was not moved by the tragedy. He was grimly satisfied. Patton walked through the piles of bricks that used to be houses. He surveyed the craters. He had a clear message. He stated that this was a lesson. He told his staff that the army would not trade American lives for German buildings. But this was only the beginning. Patton used the ruins of Aschaffenburg as a psychological weapon. For the rest of the war, the Third Army sent a message to every town in their path. The message was simple: remember Aschaffenburg. The choice was immediate surrender or total annihilation by heavy guns. Most towns chose to surrender. They opened their gates as soon as the tanks appeared. The destruction of one city saved thousands of lives in the weeks that followed. It proved that the Americans were willing to level everything in their path to end the war. The era of German resistance was crumbling. This was the result of total war. April 1945. Major Lamberth did not receive the status of an ordinary prisoner of war. The American military police shackled his hands and moved him to a cell. He faced a military tribunal for murder. The charges did not focus on the deaths of American soldiers. In combat, that is expected. The prosecution focused on the German civilians hanging from the lampposts. Lamberth had executed his own people for attempting to surrender. The court reached a verdict quickly: guilty. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging. But the chaos of the post-war legal system intervened. Appeals moved through the bureaucracy for years. Eventually, authorities commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment. Lamberth survived, but he remained a pariah. His own countrymen refused to speak his name. He lived out his days in a cell, defined by disgrace. The destruction of Aschaffenburg is not a tale of military glory. It is a record of the cold logic of total war. At first, the American soldiers wanted a peaceful occupation. They preferred a white flag over a gunfight. But the scene changed their perspective. They saw the rows of executed civilians. They realized they were fighting a fanatic who valued Nazi ideology over the lives of his neighbors. The mood in the American ranks shifted. The soldiers stopped being liberators. They became destroyers. The footage from the ruins shows the result of this shift. High explosive shells leveled entire blocks. It serves as a grim historical reminder. Mercy has a functional limit. You can push a disciplined man too far. When that limit is reached, negotiation ends. The talking stops, and a 155mm shell arrives at the front door. The American commander gave the order to flatten the city. His goal was simple: protect his men from unnecessary casualties. History still debates this decision. Was it a tactical necessity or a war crime to erase a city from the map? The question remains unanswered. One story of vengeance ended in Aschaffenburg, but another began elsewhere. When American troops entered Dachau, the sites they found triggered a different kind of retribution. That incident changed the rules of engagement forever. The full account of the Dachau reprisal is available now.